Okay, so let's make our past problem, the one for whether we checked if a student passed or he failed. Let's make this problem a little bit more complex. This problem, and I have the program around here somewhere. So yeah, that's a program. Let's put it here. Okay, so this program is telling us whether a student passes or fails. But this program is trusting, okay, this is important, this program is trusting that the user is giving valid numbers for G1, G2, G3, G4, and G5. We are not checking the validity of these numbers, okay? That means that if the user for some reason decides to input a number that is negative here, the program will still work. It would give us a wrong answer, but it will still work, okay? Remember, computers are stupid. If you don't tell it to check whether these numbers are between 0 and 100, it's just going to take them and calculate and do whatever you told it to do. So let's check how it works when we give it negative numbers. So let's run it. Did I click on run? Okay, there we go. So input grades. So let's just input negative numbers so that we get a negative average. And look, we can even input numbers that are greater than 100. Well, less than 0, and greater than 100, for example, and 20. See, our average is 4. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 of my 5 numbers are invalid numbers because we need to have numbers that go from 0 to 100. Correct? Okay, we need these numbers, these grades. We need these grades to go from 0 to 100. So when we input these numbers, we need to do some sort of validity check. We need to check these numbers one by one and check if these numbers are between 0 and 100. So let's think of the logic here. So I'm going to input a new layer. So let's look at the logic here. So given G1, G2, G3, G4, and G5, okay, given these numbers, I would first have to check whether G1 is greater than 0 and if it's less than 100, right? So we need to check whether G1 is 0 is in this interval, right? If this turns out to be true, then I can check whether G2 is within this interval. Okay? If this turns out to be true, then I check whether G3 is within this interval. And so on and so forth. What happens though when this turns out to be false? That means that G1 is either less than 0 or more than 100. So if this turns out to be false, I have to ask the user to give G1 again. And then I would have to do this check once again, right? Because what happens if he decides to give me G1 incorrectly again? Then if I didn't go and check back whether G1 is within this interval, then I would just continue, right? But that's not how that's not how we should code. We need to code thinking that the user is stupid, okay? So, given that this thing is false, we need to give the program G1 again. And the program must check the validity of G1 once again. So, we can say that until G1 is valid, we can continue. So we have some sort of idea that this must be some sort of loop. And right now, the only loop we have seen is the while loop. Okay? So let's try to put this thing within a while loop. Remember that while, if it turns out to be true, it does some code and then it returns. If it turns out to be false, then it exits the loop. Okay? So we need to check whether this thing is true, do some code, and then return to check whether this thing is true again. Okay? So what we can do here is while, I'm going to write this in pseudocode, while G1 is less than 0. And look at this. Well, I'm going to be using another operator, another logic operator that we saw. And this is a conditional operator. While G1 is less than 0 or G1 is greater than 100, I need to ask the user. So I'm going to, let's see, write. I'm going to say invalid number, give another. And I'm going to actually read a new value for G1. And this is my while loop. And while. So while G1 is less than 0 or G1 is greater than 100, so that means whether if G1 is an incorrect number, I'm going to be asking for a new number of G1. So write invalid number, give another. We read G1 and we check if G1 is less than 0 or G1 is greater than 100. If this thing turns out to be true, then we need to ask the user for another number for G1 again, okay? If this turns out to be false, so that means that our number is actually valid, we end our while, and we would have to check then the validity of G2. And how do we check the validity of G2? Well, using the exact same code. While G2 is less than 0 or G2 is greater than 100, we would have to write invalid G2, give another. And then we would have to read G2. So let's put that into code, okay? Let's go to our PCInt, this one right here. So after we input the grades, G1, G2, G3, G4, and G5, we need to check the validity of those G scores. So we're going to use a while loop. Let's put it here. And our while was remember, if this statement is true, then it does some code and checks again. So how do we know whether this? Let me put that another way. If this thing turns out to be true, it checks again, right? So the only way that we want to be looping is if our code is incorrect. So that is why we need to say if G1 is less than 0, or we can just simply put that in Spanish as an O, or G1 is greater than 100. If this turns out to be true, our code is incorrect, our number is incorrect, so we would have to input, and you know what, just to make this simple, I'm not going to use that many, I'm just going to use 2 numbers, okay? Why? Because it's a repetitive code, okay? So I'm just going to input 2 numbers. Okay, so the average is going to be G1 plus G2 divided by 2. So if G1 is less than 0 or G1 is greater than 100, then we would have to say invalid G1 value, input another. So input again. Okay, and we would have to read the new value for G1. Okay, and we will do the check again. If this new value for G1 is less than 0 or greater than 100, we would have to tell the user input the value again. Until our value for G1 is valid, then we can continue. If we continue, then we would have to check for G2. Okay, so let's do our check for G2. And we do this exactly the same way. How do I, oh, there we go. So now we would check if G2 is less than 0 or G2 is greater than 100. Okay, if this turns out to be true, I would have to say invalid G2 value, input again, sorry. And I would have to read G2. Okay? if this turns out, if this is false, okay, so until we have a valid number for G2, then we would be able to calculate the average. Oh, so in that case, this thing must go down here, okay? So let's see how this works. Let's run it. So let's input grades 20 and 30. Our average is 25, we fail, okay? Now let's input 20, 30. Oh, sorry, I did the same thing again. Let's input negative 20 and 30. So it tells us invalid G1 value. So let's be dumb and let's input 120. It's going to tell us invalid G1 value. Input again. So let's negative 40. Invalid G1, negative 30, 150. So until we give it an actual G1 value that's from 0 to 100, so let's say 50, then we have an average, okay? Why? Because G1 was incorrect, and G2 was correct. So let's give both incorrect numbers. Invalid G1, so now let's give it a correct value. Now it's telling us that G2 is incorrect. So let's give it actually a good value. There we go. Our average is 65. Okay? So that is it. We checked whether G1 or G2 were correct values. Okay? We did a validity check. If we wanted to calculate with 5 numbers, then we would have to put this thing 5 times. G1, G2, for G1, G2, G3, G4, and G5. Let's look at the actual code, and look, it's exactly as we, oh no, I forgot to write this hacer part on the pseudocode, but it's basically mientras G2 sea menor a 0 o G2 sea mayor a 100, hacer, escribir, invalid G2 value, input again, leer, G2, and end our while, okay? So look at the pseudocode, it's pretty simple. I don't know if this password failed too. So that is it for this video, and I hope it was useful. Bye.